This is the workshop on innovative regulatory policy business strategies to digital inclusion, workshop 484. Sorry, we're just doing a sound test before we start. Want to talk?
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
More.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Carlos. I'm very happy to be in Oslo. Okay, cool.
Claire.
Hi, my name is Claire.
Okay. Good. Right. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who've just joined us and are planning to be part of this roundtable discussion, which it is meant to be, please feel free to come up and join the roundtable so that we can involve you in the discussion. If others of you are here for other reasons, of course, please carry on. But for those of you who'd like to come up here and join us, please do. Right. Okay. Well, we'll start this session, and perhaps just by little bit by way of background, is that this session really is prompted by some work that has been done in the context of the G20 under the South Africa's presidency, which has one of the core pillars, which is being focused on the Digital Economy Working Group, is on equitable digital inclusion. And this very much builds on the previous G20 work done under Brazil, which looked at extending conceptions and measuring meaningful connectivity as developed by the Broadband Commission and the Digital Cooperation roadmap work that was done, which was looking at issues very much of affordability in addition to universal access at a period of time. And then, of course, the meaningful connectivity as developed by the ITU and CETIC for the Brazilian G20 presidency was very much looking at what you required besides a sort of minimal broadband connection. And so the concept of meaningful connectivity included in the Brazilian case, issues of quality, issues of affordability, and then also some acknowledgement from the really extraordinary demand-side work that CETIC does across Latin America, but particularly in Brazil, some of the issues of the kind of digital skills, the basic skills that you would need in order to be able to meaningfully access the internet. So under the South African G20 presidency, the concept of meaningful connectivity has been extended to include some of those out-of-scope factors that the meaningful connectivity work done under the Brazilian presidency was looking at. And those really included what people did online, which are very extensively covered in the African After Access surveys done by Research ICT Africa, and who's a knowledge partner to the South African government for the G20, and is working with the ITU on extending this conception under the presidency. So there we're looking at some of the Brazil out-of-scope issues, which include limitations on people's ability to transact financially. So issues around, are you able to hear? Are you able to hear? Okay. Issues around being able to, for example, digital inclusion, transact digitally online, able to be aware of some of the security threats that might exist online, able to effectively protect your data, those kinds of things. So we look at a lot more things than just the connectivity issues, whether you're able to access government services, whether you have digital ID. It's a very extensive beyond connectivity survey, although fulfills all the requirements of the ITU international standards standardization. So the important part of this complementary aspect to that was saying, despite the evidence that we've had of these primary demand-side constraints, which are attached to affordability, but are not limited only to affordability issues, especially when you're talking about digital inclusion, not simply connectivity. So the results of the data, both in Brazil and in Southeast Asia, where it's been done with partners at Learn Asia, and across Africa, shows that the main barrier to accessing the internet is the cost of the device. Okay, so that's within a whole regulatory business model. That cost of that device, as it currently is and currently regulated, etc., is unaffordable to the majority of Africans, and in fact, for little chance of it being affordable under existing conditions for a lot of the population. The barriers then for data, which are often made as barriers to access, but the barriers to use are then the price of data. But the main barrier is the price of the device, and there are many things that one could do to reduce that device, but the question is whether it could be enough to be affordable. But more importantly, what we see is that when people are online or have access to a device, they are unable to use that device very meaningfully. So, for example, in our micro-enterprise surveys, we see that although a number of people in the South African case, for example, not all across Africa, actually have a smart device, they're only able to use it they only use it for WhatsApp. They're unable to use this whole array of small business apps that now exist, for example. And so I think the important part of this is that because these surveys are nationally representative and we can model them, we can see that the main drivers of internet access and use, the main determinant of whether you're going to have access and how you're going to be able to use it, the intensity of use, the scope of use, correlates with education. So your level of education, which correlates with income, of course, employment and income, will determine whether you have access to the internet and the degree to which you're able to use it meaningfully or effectively or optimally. And certainly whether you can use it for not just transacting that, but for purposes of production or well-being of your home, etc. So the main issue that's been presented with the ongoing work by multilateral organizations within the Broadband Commission and across the UN is that there is still a focus in addressing the digital divide on issues of connectivity. Current projects, there's very, very large multi-million euro projects underway that are trying to establish what existing investment is needed to ensure that the last 8% of the population, only 8% of the population aren't under current mobile broadband coverage. And so the challenge for us is that we've got least developed countries throughout Africa, Rwanda, Uganda, and Mozambique, with above 95% coverage, some of them 99% coverage, and yet they have less than 20% connectivity. So the challenge is, for many countries, is not a supply-side challenge, and I am talking just about digital inclusion, so basic level. Of course, those economies need to be able to develop 4 and 5G, all sorts of other business things. But in terms of addressing the inclusion problem, some of our challenges have been that we continue to look at costing 4G, 5G infrastructure that's needed to get universal coverage at a global level, when in fact we could be getting reasonably meaningful connectivity, even at 3G, but arguably at 4G, and we have that across many countries. But people are unable, nevertheless, despite having coverage, to use the internet. They either cannot afford it, or they do not have the educational skills to use it meaningfully, or even very often beyond quite basically. So what we are trying with this initiative under the G20, South Africa's G20 presidency, is to say, let's respond to this now quite large-scale Global South evidence that the primary constraints on internet access are demand-side constraints, and start shifting the discussion on the digital divide from a purely connectivity discussion with possibly a little bit of kind of digital skills, digital literacy. That is not going to be sufficient to systemically move countries towards digital equality. So shifting this discussion purely from a connectivity debate to a non-connectivity debate to actually saying, how do we firstly identify digital inequality? How do we measure it? And what are the policy responses that we need to redress it? And I think this is the sort of fundamental digital digital equality paradox, this wicked policy problem that we've been facing, that the Global Digital Compact tries to address, that multiple rounds of the G20 under India, Brazil and South Africa's developing country economies are trying to address, is that actually as we layer these new technologies over existing structural and other inequalities, we are actually amplifying those inequalities. And unlike the old voice and text kind of environment where one knew that one was doing that between the connected and the unconnected, it's not only between the connected and unconnected, of course it's there, but it's also between those who are barely connected, who are on tiny bits of data, really not meaningfully connected, and those who are able to transact effectively and participate in the economy, seeing as this is a digital economy working group focus, and then of course those who are able to produce using these technologies. So with that longer than intended introduction, let me turn to our panelists here, and of course our wonderful panelists online, which I shall hopefully are still online, and I should have introduced much earlier on. But in the room here we have Carlos Rey Moreno, who is from the APC, from the Association for Progressive Communication, but worked along intersections with various other NPOs over many years in the area of digital inequality and connectivity and inclusion and community networks specifically, but he's going to talk about new developments around social enterprises today. And then we also have Claire Sipthorpe, who is with the GSMA, and particularly the Mobile for Development, Inclusive Development component of that, is going to speak to us about GSMA's long-standing work in this area. And then we've got online Steve Song, now from the Internet Society. I think many of you might have know Steve very well from Mozilla and various other things before. And then we also have Gillian Marcel, who is joining us, I think, from Germany today, but usually not there. Who's an independent consultant, but I think many of us will be known to many of us as working extensively across Africa, especially in the very exciting early days of mobile mobile telephony, actually, initially, and then it's all happened so fast. And then, of course, very much involved with the policy and regulatory initiatives towards getting universal access, both at within multilateral organizations, but also technically advising operators and regulators across the continent. So a very exciting team, which is finally we've joined by Sophie Maddens, who works with the ITU and has been very involved with the World Development Telecommunications Conference, which you could also update us on, who've also been preoccupied with the kind of extensive demands on regulators and, the extended mandates that they're facing with these rapidly diversifying technologies and the demands that are arising from those. So I think we are just going to start off with Sophie telling us a little bit about what the ITU is doing in this area. I think she has also been tracking what we've been doing within the G20 with the ITU partnerships in many of the digital areas. But Sophie, just if you could tell us where some of the intersections between these issues that we're discussing, these demand-side constraints, and some of the very interesting regional deliberations you've had on these issues.
Thank you, Alison, and good morning, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Alison, if you permit, I'm going to build on your introductory statements because really you set the scene in a perfect manner, because we all see how digital has and continues to impact all sector and aspects of our lives. So think of e-health, e-agriculture, e-education, and e-government services, innovation opportunities for value creation, and the skills needed for adoption, and the infrastructure for access, because it's really about access, adoption, and value creation. That's what the digital transformation is all about. So, but we still have 2.6 billion people not connected to the internet. So there is and must be a sense of urgency with all these people still unconnected. And that really is the core of our work, really that sense of urgency to connect the unconnected, but also to make sure that everybody has a meaningful experience through the connectivity. Our concern is as well that the digital divide still persists in many areas, rural areas, urban areas, across income, across gender, across age groups. And there are deep new divides that have emerged for vulnerable groups. So really addressing that demand side is key, because the challenge, it's not just one of infrastructure development. And of course, as ITU, we work on infrastructure development, but expanding that connectivity is not enough, because having access or being online are not sufficient to benefit fully from the connectivity. And today we see deep divides. So we see the risk of creating a multi-speed digital world, as you yourself mentioned, Alison. And so the fear is that a privileged few, those equipped with infrastructure, with skills, with the resources, with the expensive devices, that they are the ones that drive and benefit from AI innovation, while marginalized or vulnerable communities and groups are left behind. And so that's why that universal and meaningful connectivity, it's important to consider and address that. And how do we define it? It's enabling everyone to enjoy a safe, enriching and productive online experience at an affordable cost. It does not mean everybody must be connected all the time, but it describes a situation, as you said, Alison, where anyone can access the internet, but optimally, affordably, whenever and wherever they need. And that also must be an objective of digital policy. So as you said, UMC is built on 6 interdependent dimensions: quality of the connection, availability for use, affordability of devices, skills, and security. And each of these dimensions contribute to that meaningful digital experience and strength, and one cannot compensate for weakness in the other. So UMC has and must continue to be a vital policy objective. And let me highlight one issue here. Data is key to the success of this policy objective, because you cannot fix what you do not know. Achieving UMC also requires a holistic strategy. So we think of infrastructure development, but also policy frameworks, education initiatives, and of course, the multi-stakeholder engagement. And let's go even further to ensure that no one is left behind, which brings me to digital inclusion, which is that holistic intersectional approach to promoting ICT and digital accessibility, so that we can together build a digitally inclusive world for all, regardless of age, gender, ability, or geographic location. And that's why we at ITU are keen to share best practices, foster regional and global collaboration, so that together we can build those inclusive societies, economies, and environments. And we provide assistance to our membership to formulate, implement, and promote ICT policies and strategies for digital inclusion. And we also work to empower diverse groups, including youth, women and girls, particularly in rural, remote, underserved and unserved areas and communities, but also including older persons like myself, persons with disabilities, and persons with specific needs, and of course, Indigenous people and communities. That to reduce the digital divide and enable everyone to actively participate in the digital world. I'll leave it at that for now and come back with more thoughts later.
Thank you very much for that, Sophie. And we'll move on to Steve Song to talk about it, just reminding us that in this round, we just want to identify what exactly the problem is, your take on what those problems are, and then we'll move to solutions in the next round. And then also just to, again, invite the audience who want to participate on the round table and pose questions or just listen closer by. Please do feel free to come up and join the conversation. Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Alison. I think we exist at a particularly critical point at the moment, in that with two conflicting trends. One is that the growth of access is plateauing, right? And that is, the reason for that is that we've connected the parts that are easy and affordable to connect, and that the people can there's a business model to sustain connectivity there. The remaining 2.9 billion are going to require a different approach. At the same time, as you mentioned, Alison, telecommunications and the internet is a force multiplier. It's an amplifier. And so those 2.9 billion people who are unconnected are falling further behind all the time as those with access actually, profit from the benefits of access. So having a strategy now that focuses on the inclusion of everyone is absolutely critical. And I think this points to regulatory issues where we've been focused on, promoting competition. Well, that's still extremely important, but we need to now go beyond competition and have strategies for inclusion. And the existing models, which have been extraordinarily successful to date, especially mobile networks and their growth, remain a tremendously important mechanism for providing affordable access, but there's limits to how far they can go and what they can do, and whether their business models are viable in the most challenging parts of the world. And the way I like to describe this is, if you think of connectivity as a jar you're trying to fill, in every country there are typically 2 or 3 or 4 mobile network operators, and they're like stones you're trying to fit into that jar, and you can fit 3 or maybe 4 stones in that jar, and the jar looks full. But in fact, if you fill that jar with water, still more than 50% of it remains empty. And what is needed now is regulation that actually, accommodates those smaller operators, those differently shaped operators, whether they are, municipalities or cooperatives or nonprofits or national research and education networks that can fill in those shapes in different ways. And another way of explaining this is to say, you think of it like forest management. Monocultures have historically been extraordinarily unsuccessful, very vulnerable, and not the way to create a healthy ecosystem. In a healthy ecosystem, we want to protect small plants and new growth to create diversity in the ecosystem. And we need to do the same thing with telecommunications and the internet. We need to protect small operators and encourage their growth so that they create different business models. They challenge affordability paradigms, and they go where large operators you don't necessarily want to go. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Steve. I've been biting my tongue trying to, since Sophie spoke, to just urge you to look at the paper where we do applying the universal meaningful connectivity conception, not even our own more extended equitable digital inclusion conception, point out that 2.6 unconnected in terms of basic connectivity, as previously described, in terms of the application of meaningful connectivity, which the G20 under Brazil very courageously looked at Brazil and their universal access figure previously, their internet penetration figures previously above 80%, when they applied the meaningful connectivity formula, went right down to 20%. So using again the same extrapolation, yes, 2.6 people unconnected, and as Sophie points out, such bad data that those could be out by, several 100,000 possibly millions. But that's another part of that we are also trying to promote. But the figure more like the people who are really not digitally included, substantively digitally included, is much closer to 4 billion or 4.5 billion. In terms of that definition that we've used before and that we are now using in the South African G20 process. So it's getting those unconnected, but also those not meaningfully connected online. So Claire, perhaps if you'd come in there, because Steve has mentioned some of the limitations, but despite the success of the mobile operators, especially on the African continent, there are some limitations now in reaching those so-called uneconomic areas or people, subscribers.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alison. And I'm going to talk about, obviously from the mobile perspective, because that's, mobile is the primary way most people, and often only way most people access the internet. And I think, we also do these country national representative surveys like Research ICT Africa and find exactly the same things as you're finding. And if we look at the problem, so in terms of mobile internet, if 57% of the world is now connected to mobile internet, of the unconnected, if you break it down, there's only 4% who don't live in areas without coverage, mobile broadband coverage. So the majority of those, so 39%, which is 90% of the unconnected, live in areas where there's covered, but they can't use it. So if 90% of the people who are not connected, it's not a coverage issue. It's the fact that they face other barriers to using it. And the people who are unconnected, and I think it's been mentioned already, it's predominantly people in rural areas, people with lower education, lower income, women, people, persons with disabilities. So we, for example, just published our latest mobile gender gap report, which shows that women in low and middle income countries are 14% less likely than men to use the internet. And in fact, that gender gap has stalled. So we're not seeing, a great deal of progress in that regard. But in our surveys, we look at, why are people not using the internet or not getting online? And then once they're online, why are they only using it in these very limited ways, as you said? And our research has similar findings to you. So the biggest barrier to getting online is the affordability of a device. And you mentioned it, also about how it's challenging. And I think if I'm always struck by the number from Africa. If you, in our analysis, we looked at if you are in the poorest 20% of people living in sub-Saharan Africa, it's costing 99% of your average monthly income to buy an entry-level internet-enabled device. So this is a very significant problem that needs a lot of thought in terms of how to address it. It's not an easy solution. There's the two top barriers to getting online is the affordability of device, and the second is literacy and digital skills. And then once people go online, we ask people what's stopping you from using it more. Why is it this sort of limited? And in our research, it's showing again. Safety and security concerns become a big issue. Affordability, more of data at this point also emerges. So, we have to look at the barriers around affordability, skills, relevance of, relevant content and services, safety and security issues. If we're really going to move the needle and we're really going to get people online, not just online, but using it to help meet their life needs. And it's that usage gap. It's that that really is where we need to be focusing our efforts to really move the needle. And like you, it's, segments like women who are lower income, lower education are disproportionately affecting. But we've also done, some analysis that looked at if you held, the same women and men of the same income education levels, there would still be, for example, a gender gap because things like social norms and these other factors also play. So if you're wanting to, you have to consider, these structural inequalities as well as social norms and some of these big barriers, and we need to think beyond coverage, and we need to think, and we need to think beyond, a certain single stakeholder, as to, and how we can address these barriers, as has been said repeatedly in this panel. Now it's only exacerbating inequalities, and it's absolutely critical that we move this needle.
Thank you so much. And before we carry on, I'm just going to ask the audience, particularly to sort of prime themselves. We've been talking about, and we'll continue to talk about, a lot of access solutions, regulatory strategies to reduce prices, issues of affordability. But I think, a lot of this demand-side evidence is demonstrating that we can no longer solve this problem with siloed sort of sectoral solutions. There's, we can remove taxes from mobile phones. We can do a number of things, but actually we really need transversal digital policies that will focus on our education challenges, these fundamental challenges that we are facing, human development challenges, and that the gender questions as have been historically posed, which homogenize, women, really aren't helping us with policy interventions that really need to be focused at, women at the intersection of those multiple other inequalities. So if you look overall at issues of sort of rural deficits in terms of access to the internet, and you compare it with gender, rural is worse off. Now, obviously, there's also a lot of women concentrated in those rural areas. But in fact, if you look at some of our data with, it's an issue of the poor. And it's also issues of kind of location and those kinds of things. So if there were actually, they're poor men who are worse off than urban poor women just because of their proximity. So we really need sort of far more nuanced interventions, but we also need interventions that are way beyond certainly the telecommunication sector, communication sector, the historical sectors that look at this problem. If we can go to Carlos. Carlos, some of the problem setting has been stated, so please do just add to that. Yeah. But if you'd also just move to what you see as some of the possible solutions that we could deal here on the access side, and then we're hoping for some really innovative responses on some of the non-access ways in which we can address this problem as well.
Thank you so much, Alison. And I want to go back to one of the points that you mentioned in the introduction around costing, how much money is needed to close the digital divide from an infrastructure point of view. And I believe there are way too many conversations about costing, how much does it cost to close the digital divide. And I believe we are going to hear a new figure at some point this year. And not that much about how that investment could be used differently, how to enable other models, no? In also coming from the G20 in Brazil, the Digital Investment Infrastructure Initiative from the ITU and several second-tier development banks stated that stakeholders should think beyond typical for-profit models to cover 70% of the remaining access gaps, financing the same actors, considering the same ways of building infrastructure is leading to some part of this inequality that we see, due to the return on investment that they are seeking, due to other practices, as we've heard. But it is surprising to also see that the Global Digital Compact is referring to investing in local networks to close the digital divide, right? Because why it happens that some of these local networks are socially driven models that go way beyond the transactional way that we've understood the internet so far. Enterprises are transacting for a price, a service that is internet connectivity, period, right? There are these other models based on socially driven intentions, I would say, or bottom lines, social bottom lines or environmental bottom lines, social enterprises that go beyond those transactional models, those transactional services. They provide social inclusion services. They provide transformational services that at the end of the day create a circular economy, maintain the money locally to develop other small enterprises that develop the local skills required not only to run that particular local network, but to run other businesses in the community that contribute to creating culturally relevant content and services using sensor networks, for instance, and that contribute quite significantly to local innovation. We were talking about innovation before. The amount of innovation that can come from the communities and from the rural areas is astonishing, addressing their own community needs and their own problems. Yet, education systems are more proposing that those rural people go and contribute to the economies as we see them in urban areas and not to the problems that they are facing locally. So thinking through how that supply and demand meet with this type of interventions that stimulate circular economies locally, I think is also a way of thinking about the equitable digital inclusion that you alluded to, Alison. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll come back to that. Before we go into speaking a little further on some of the solutions, are there any questions from the room as we also try and gather some questions online? I know we've got a number of people online. Are there any questions or comments from the room at this point? Okay, Leslie, what do we have online?
If we can turn to Peter for that, but also to hear from Gillian as well.
Yep. Okay, so while we gather some of those online questions. We are also going to ask Gillian to come in. Gillian, if you could also add to your extensive experience on what some of the problems are, but also move on to what you see as some of the solutions, which I know you've put a lot of thought into.
Certainly, and thank you so much, Alison, for the invitation to join this panel with so many pioneers. Actually, I want to go in a different direction, if I may, because I think it's important to actually put a theoretical framing on this question of how do we actually achieve equitable digital inclusion, because all of those premises and all of those words actually matter. And in listening to my colleagues, and I was listening very carefully, what I didn't hear come up is the root causes that lead to exclusion and that lead to inequity. And the root causes, in my view, are the fact that we have an extractive economic system on which we are then trying to layer demand and supply side solutions. So, to my mind, equitable digital inclusion will be achieved when laws, regulation, policy, ecosystem strengthening, entrepreneurship, finance, and investment take place. But if they do within the status quo, then nothing will change. And we will still have what we've called the unconnected last mile problems. And we will still be talking about the things that we've been talking about for 25 years. And my own work in this area has been, as Alison mentioned, from the policy and regulatory lens, but I was also deeply involved in financing, and not financing at a small scale, but financing from the pioneers of the African telecoms revolution. And I will say that there was innovation at a narrative level in that time, which is now nearly 25 years ago, because when we were making models to look at whether or not investing in Nigeria was a good thing for MTN to do, there was no data. And so when I hear my colleagues talk about the fact that you can't get reliable information about the cost of a handset or what you would price data at, that leaves out a fundamental issue, which is risk. We want to encourage the private sector to take risks and to benefit from a return. And so whatever we do from the policy and regulatory domain should not exclude or leave out the fact that some private sector solutions and providers will succeed and others will fail. And there should not be an attempt to stop that from happening under the presumption that that is the way to connect the unconnected. One final point. If a mobile handset, like the one I have here, is an asset for production and for well-being, there are in existence alternative collateral models for financing things that people need. And so, in looking at the things that we need to be doing, not only from a policy and regulatory side in the telecoms or in the tech sector, we also need to be looking at what are the enabling conditions that would allow for a variety of solutions that tackle all of the very good things that I've heard from my colleagues, but do not assume that the direction of change is going to be coming from policy and regulatory only. Because that then leaves out a very important engine of change, which has been shown to work. And I'll leave it there for now and say a little bit more about what I think needs to be done so that we don't end up with a digital society that is anywhere like the United States, where you've had Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley values and norms produce a digital society that is about as toxic as we could possibly imagine. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much for that, Gillian. I'm hoping that we'll get some responses to that. I did want to draw your attention, those of you who had a chance to look at the issues paper, to indicate that this is not only a policy and regulatory alternatives. We're looking at alternative business strategies. We're looking at cooperatives, social enterprises, which we'll come back to. I think we are, though, looking at some of the public interest policy and regulatory failures that we've seen. And I think we are looking at new shifts that are acknowledging that despite the enabling conditions that have been created for the extraordinary investments that we've seen by mobile networks on the African continent, but also now, of course, fiber networks across the continent, the creation of these conditions, we've prioritized the supply side valuation of resources and really neglected the demand side valuation of resources that would recognize these critical resources, as digital public goods and increasingly global digital public goods that require demand side interventions if they are to serve as critical inputs in the economy and to be universally accessible as we require digital public goods to be. And so one of the mechanisms that we think is a real travesty in the long theoretical and economic regulatory competition levers that they're meant to be is the market reviews that have barely been conducted on the African continent, and the the need to assess dominance in markets and effectively remedy that. And I think there's extraordinary evidence of the impacts of wholesale access regulation in opening up markets that has been got to the point where it's meant to be implemented and would have changed the environment very, very differently to what it is now. And through the ethos of creating the certainty for investors and getting the certainty for investors, I would argue, Gillian, there's been an open conversation to that commercial supply side assessment spectrum with anything that's gone without creating the public value, the commons aspects of this that would have allowed greater inclusion. And I know, Steve, your work has also focused on this, and now not only kind of wholesale, leased facilities and those kinds of things, but of course, very importantly, with mobile operators in many parts of the continent actually being the dominant operators, no longer the old fixed networks, access to APIs that would have just changed this environment entirely. And I just wondered if you want to pick up on that.
Yeah, I think wholesale access is increasingly a massive barrier to the development of affordable access. Typically, in many countries, it costs more to transit inside the country via fiber than it does to connect internationally, and there has to be mechanisms for bringing down the cost of backhaul, which is increasingly the highest burden of cost especially for small operators in terms of operating costs. Things like structural separation, breaking out the backbone from the incumbents and setting it up as a separate company is a great step forward. But I think there are even better things to do. One of my favorite examples is Chorus in New Zealand, who is formerly part of the incumbent and was separated out into a backbone network across New Zealand, and who have implemented effectively flat pricing across the country. So anywhere you can connect to a Chorus network, you can peer at the same price as if you are in the capital city or very close to it. And that's a huge issue. We see national research and education networks like Tenet Sanren in South Africa implementing the same thing so that universities connect to their national backbone network at the same price, no matter where they are, whether they're rural or urban. If you were to implement those strategies across, say, state-owned backbones, you would unlock competition. You would incentivize small operators to deliver services in rural areas where they simply can't at the moment because of the cost of backhaul.
Thanks very much for that, Steve. Claire, I was wondering if you wanted to come in on the mobile, the regulatory, and possibly what alternatives GSMA is looking at in addressing these sort of so-called uneconomic areas.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
also, if you do have non-mobile strategy, non-technical or sectoral strategies, if you're actually supporting education or other initiatives, please highlight those as well.
Yeah, as I said in sort of the opening comment, I think the biggest issue in terms of connectivity is not the coverage. I mean, obviously coverage is important, but it's not only a coverage issue. And on the coverage point, I think, where those areas where it's not economical for operators to cover, looking at how they can be covered and the different models is really important. But I do think that we need to also really look at these, coverage is, the data shows coverage is not going to get people connected and using the internet. Coverage alone. Obviously, coverage is an important prerequisite, but alone it's not, as I said, 90% of the people who are not using it are covered. So what we do need to do is address things like affordability of devices. And I think there's a range of strategies that can be done there. Taxation is a big issue, reducing taxation, looking at innovative device financing schemes, looking at subsidy schemes, because the cost of these devices is not on its own going to get down to the level that the people who are not connected can afford. So we need to think about that. But literacy and digital skills are also critical, and again, I think that requires multi-stakeholder, multi-agency intervention. So we need to be building in digital skills, across education and training programs of the government and across, and ensuring that those things, those initiatives help highlight, how the internet's relevant for different segments. I think a lot of the time we see in our research, people say this, it's not for me because they see rural maybe in the marketing or awareness campaigns, urban men, and not necessarily reflecting themselves and their life needs, but also ensuring that those training campaigns build in elements around how to keep yourself safe and secure online and address all those issues. And I think in terms of what the mobile operators, so I think, first of all, I think it can't be done by one stakeholder, but mobile operators are doing this. So they're doing a range of device financing, looking at data that they get from their networks to as alternative credit scorings to provide device financing, providing a lot of digital skills training. We have GSMA has created a mobile internet skills training toolkit, which is a free open source Creative Commons training content that can be used to provide people the basic skills to get online, to use the internet and use it safely. It's now been used, across 40 countries. Been trained. I think 75 million people now, at least, have been trained. So I think we're trying, because I think we found a lot of the digital skills campaigns are also focused on laptops and tablets, but those are not the devices people are using their hands, and so they weren't able to translate that training into ways that they could use in their lives. So we've tried to address some of that gap. But I think it requires, interventions by quite, a range of people. And I think we need to be focusing on these sort of, as you say, the demand side barriers. And we need to be thinking across stakeholder groups as to how we do that, to make sure that we're really able for people to get online and get online safely and meet and use the internet to meet their their life needs. So.
Thanks very much, Claire. Carlos, could you talk to us a little bit about, we've spoken about some of the sort of failures, regulatory failures and those sorts of things, but and in regard to some of the more kind of systemic issues around, that would change things at scale around getting greater competition and through wholesale access and driving down prices. But there've also been, when Steve was speaking in the beginning about a few big stones, or just like, lots of stones, or I think, as Steve's often said, let 1,000 flowers bloom kind of models. The ability of niche innovations, community services, now social enterprises services to break into the system has, had relatively high regulatory transaction costs. Mm-hmm. And what do you see as the key levers there if one accepts that these are actually the way that one can address some of the systemic challenges that we're facing?
Thank you so much, Alison. Well, I think one of it, or the most important one, is recognition and a deepened insight into the value of a diversified ecosystem of actors. We see that still there are, like this mindset of only traditional large operators, countrywide operators can solve certain problems. And again, those are doing great, but only contributing or providing services from that transactional perspective that I was alluding to, and not entering in the transformational aspect that the internet could bring into this aspect. So that would be the one, recognition that other actors are needed and that other actors are contributing. Because when those actors are provided with an enabling regulatory environment, well, here in Europe, for instance, where there is a vast array of small operators providing fiber optics, wireless, you name it, even private mobile networks in certain areas, you just need to declare your activity, your provision of telecommunication services. In the Philippines, you need a congressional franchise. The Congress needs to allow you to deploy infrastructure. So reducing the regulatory barriers of what do you need to actually start some sort of a business practice, whether social or not, certainly is going to allow for those smaller stones that Steve was alluding to actually grow and thrill, right? I think also touching a bit on what Gillian was saying about that we need to establish innovative financing and investment models that allow these small and localized operators to thrill. I have the feeling that in the financial sector, a lot of the interest has been on supporting the interest of capital and not supporting the interest of people. I think 20 years after WSIS, we need to start recognizing the financial models to think through or to understand how we can support smaller operators, smaller ticket sizes, understanding what are the needs of those smaller actors are critical, and there are starting to be some very interesting models around this. And lastly, capacity building. We are super proud to have launched last week the first course with the ITU in Africa for technical promoters at the community level after 5 editions in Latin America. And I think once you have that regulatory frame, once you have the recognition, once you have the regulatory framework, once you have the innovative financing and investment models in place, if enough skills and enough awareness is around for people to take benefit and advantage of this financing and these regulatory interventions, we see this thrilling. In Kenya, there are 20 community networks already, and more will come. In Colombia, there are across the same number. In Brazil, that there has been a magnificent collaboration with the regulator. There are more than 50, right? So when those things start to appear, more of those diversified actors and local innovation is going to take place to create those other impacts that I was alluding to in relation to circular economies, local innovation, and culturally relevant content and services. So, yeah.
Carlos, I suppose some of the skepticism is kind of scaling this. Mm-hmm. That yes, great to see that capacity building. How many people have been trained? How many people can be trained? Mm-hmm. So what kind of more systematic opportunities there are? But I think some of the kind of collective response. So if one, enables all of these smaller providers, if one enables different kinds of capacity building if one gets curriculum actually, it's sort of properly more entrenched in curriculums and stuff. Collectively, we could see some outcomes. But I think one of the main challenges, one of the things has been around like demand stimulation, that actually for the people now who are not online, big challenges around awareness of the internet. These are obviously least educated people, and of course very little local language content for people. So there seems to be a particular role for these social enterprise organizations, community organizations that are able to also produce content that could stimulate the internet take-up.
So someone that was said at a session yesterday was in relation to fair trade, right? Was in relation to creating the same environment as has been created for social and solidarity economy in other sectors, agriculture, retail, you name it, to really reach the scale that there would be enough products and trainings and whatnot, as you were saying, whole of government approach. If this was a course that every TVET in every country would teach how someone could start a small business in their area around telecommunications as they do with agriculture or with retail or with car mechanics or whatever, certainly you can start creating this type of scale that you were referring to. And the same with mechanisms, with financing mechanisms. We were talking this morning at a discussion with someone that in Kenya you need at least 20% of interest to pay 20% of interest rates to get a loan for a small operator, because there is not that understanding, there is not that awareness in the financial sector locally that these small operators can actually do any of this, right? So that type of financial sector deepening, that type of engaging with local financial institutions so they can make available products that are accessible for small operators and small social enterprises in the country would be very much necessary, I think, for that side of scale. Going again to the 1,000 flowers blooming that Steve was talking about. But we need to look at it ecosystemically. If it's 3 or 4 philanthropic organizations giving grants here and there, we're not going to tackle any problem whatsoever.
Yeah. And of course you say whole of government, but I think some of the problems have been is that there has been a lot of investment focus in government and across government, but actually what we need is a whole of society kind of approach that hopefully government will play a more active role in creating that public value kind of environment that we want for this. I'm hoping we can go on to some questions before we go back to Gillian. Actually, Gillian's got her hand up, so let's take Gillian's question. Gillian's response while we look. Leslie, I'm hoping that you can see Peter, or can Peter hear me directly? Okay, so if we can just line up some questions, Peter. And then we've got a question, fortunately, at our very small round table. Please do come and join us. Gillian, do you want to go ahead? And then we'll take one from the floor and then we'll go online.
Certainly. What I wanted to come back to is the issue of dominance and your point about and I am assuming that you're talking about regulatory agencies in developing countries have not taken the opportunity to look at dominance and industry concentration and so on in the tech sector. And of course, we know exactly why that is the case, because so much of what happens in what is called the digital space gets its way of being from what is happening in the United States. And 25 years ago, a decision was made that deregulation and not even applying, Alison, this will be in your wheelhouse, not even applying broadcast regulations to all of these platform companies. So that the zeitgeist for regulation and public interest, the notion that tech should serve the public interest, shifted. And it shifted 25 years ago. And so we must acknowledge that. Because the reason that we are struggling with connectivity plus and so on is because people are being treated like consumers in a neoliberal framing rather than citizens who have the right to communication and the rights to access. 25 years ago, we would be having a different conversation. 25 years ago, we also had pushed the multilateral organizations into recognizing the concepts that you are speaking about, the global commons, telecoms, and so on as global public goods. And we need to get back to that. Because if we don't and recognize just how far that shift has happened, unlike when Nelson Mandela was saying in 1996 that there are more fixed lines in all of Manhattan than there are in all of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what we can say is there are people in the Bronx and in New York who cannot get access to internet. So it is the underlying economic system, not even finance. The economic system says you treat people like consumers in a market for profit maximization, and then you layer everything on top of that. So that's what I wanted to come back to, because all of the things that we're talking about, market concentration, regulatory capture, the limits of regulatory power, the sort of the meekness of those interventions also come from that shaping of the frame. And there are things that we can do. We should not accept that it's a foregone conclusion, but we must also see from where this has originated as well.
Thank you so much, Gillian. And we have a question from our roundtable. If you'd introduce yourself, and then I see somebody standing up there as well. Please, if you want to join us, do. Please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. So I'm Leandro Navarro. I'm coming from an initiative called e-Reuse and also from APC. And I wanted to highlight, because it's being discussed, when it comes to talking about inclusion, it makes sense to count in, let's say, millions or billions, not unconnected. But when it comes to meaningful connectivity, probably you don't find it on the amount of packets, IP packets that you get, but on what you do. What you do, what enables, the value, and so forth. But also, as it was commented, I haven't seen anyone connected directly to the internet. They connect through a device. And so, typically, we've been looking in community networks or in network infrastructure to the last mile. But I think it's important to look at the last meter, because in the last meter is when the action happens, when the meaningful part occurs. So imagine that we are talking about water. It's very important to have water, but it depends if I have a glass, or if I have a toilet, or if I have a swimming pool. It's completely different, and that is the meaning there. I'm swimming, I'm doing exercise, or I'm eating because I have a pot and I'm cooking my food. So you cannot see it on the network layer. So I think it's important to look at the last meter. And in the last meter, well, there are devices. It's not the same. We have been doing projects in which we go to schools in Uganda and we replace mobile phones by laptops, because a mobile phone is not useful for learning, but a laptop can be. So it makes a big difference. So once we go beyond the challenge of bringing the internet there, then the next thing is which device is there. And it's interesting to see that there are unconnected people, but also there are unused devices. And then, regarding affordability, there is this interesting opportunity that there are devices which are no longer used by one owner, but still they have a lot of years of lifespan. And then, refurbish them, collecting them, and giving them to people that need a device that it shouldn't be the last model in the market, can also help connecting the unconnected by supplying them unused devices and helping the environment. So, there are a lot of potential in the last meter, and also in creating affordable devices which do not need to be manufactured again. So, well, I think it's, just this is being discussed. I think the user device makes a lot of sense, a lot of meaning. to the user. Of course, the user has to know what to do with it, but the device is not the same a glass than a swimming pool. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that input. I think the importance of connectivity and the device, and these are absolutely necessary conditions. So nobody's saying that these access issues aren't absolutely critical. I think the device refurbishment is a nice example. I think we have it in the issues paper, but I think it could be. Brazil, for example, has really very interesting examples of recycling within their circular economy policy and practice that are kind of scalable, because I think in many of our environments they've been little small project here for retraining people or something like that. So kind of getting those there's innovation out of constraint that Africa is famous for, models more effectively working to get the kind of systemic and scaling. I am hoping that some questions that we got lined up from the thing and here are also going to deal with some of the non-access issues, but please go ahead anyway.
Hi, so my name is Kevin Hernandez, and I work at the Universal Postal Union, which is the UN organization that deals with the postal sector. And my question is specifically about the non-access issues. So I think, and I want to thank all of you for all the solutions that you put forward on this panel. They've all been very interesting. And specifically, I want to thank, I don't know your name, but the person who mentioned something about community-based organizations, because I think they also play a very critical role in the last mile, not just in connecting people, but also dealing with the immediate risks of digital exclusion. And what do I mean by that? I mean, in the case when someone is not connected and all the services in their country are digitalized and you can no longer access things in person, where do people usually turn to? They usually turn to a library, they turn to a post office that might be offering e-government services and digital financial services, or they might turn to an NGO, or they might turn to some other community-based organization. But I don't really hear many solutions that are put forward that kind of focus on connecting these intermediaries, because these intermediaries play a big role in ensuring that the immediate effects of exclusion are not felt today. So we're not going to connect all the unconnected anytime soon. There are billions of them. So what do we do now to ensure that these kind of intermediaries are not left in a place where they're left to fend for themselves without any support? We need to also support these intermediaries, and how do we do that? And also, I just want to flag that I work for the UPU, and I work for a project that aims to connect every post office to the internet and leverage them for digital inclusion. So anybody who would like to learn more, you can come and find me. I have some concept notes about our project. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very useful input, and to say that, of course, a lot of the work that has been done by APC in this area and Mozilla under Steve. But anyway, I think just to emphasize that if the importance of intermediaries hasn't been highlighted enough, it absolutely should be. And I think when we were talking about some of the high transaction costs for community services and those kinds of things, is precisely to enable that kind of intermediary intervention. I think another interesting policy aspect to that, though, the challenge has been not to allow the state to abdicate its responsibilities to, we'll just let those communities sort of sort out this little kind of minimalist network there or something, but to actively support them as part of programs, and it's a state's responsibility to do that, and or to ensure that the licensed operator or whatever actually does serve those communities. So I think it's an important policy debate, and I'm still hoping for some grand strategy that's going to solve the underlying human development challenge. So let's go online and see what we have there. Peter, can you hear me? I keep looking at Leslie thinking that he's got the connection to you, but can you hear me?
Thank you. Yes, I can.
Good.
There was a useful comment from Ramune about another form of intermediary. I quote, "Local libraries, when equipped with sufficient connectivity and computers for public use, contribute effectively to digital inclusion of communities they serve. Besides physical access tackling, also digital literacy, online safety and privacy issues, as well as walking people of all ages to digital learning opportunities." So putting that as a question, would you and the panel agree with that? And are there any other of those forms of intermediary, like the post office, that we just heard about?
Great. So we've actually got a minute for each of the panelists. So I'm going to let them respond to each other, which I think some have already done, and then also just to take that last question if you'd like to. Steve, would you like to go ahead?
Thanks, Alison. I think there's a thread here that that strikes me as very important. That relates to intermediaries such as post offices and libraries, but also to community networks, and that is the fact that we focus a lot on the capacity building of the consumer, right, to be able to use the network, but we don't talk as much about the ability to build the network and capacity building to build and own networks. I came across a lovely quote from Richard Feynman, one of the great physicists of the 20th century. He said, "What I cannot create, I cannot understand." And I think this is true of the internet, and it gives me pause when I think about solutions like Starlink, which are the very remarkableness is kind of also their flaw, in the sense that when you connect a Starlink dish, you just turn it on and it connects to the internet and that's it. But which is remarkable. But it also means that you don't know what an IP address is. You don't know what an autonomous system number is. You don't know how to build the network, and it is a loss of agency and control as a result. So I think that national research and education networks that are building their own fiber backbones, the same potential exists for post offices and libraries, not to just receive connectivity, but to be involved in the solution, in the provision of connectivity. And I think there's a huge risk when organizations are not involved, when citizens are not involved in that. You get situations such as we see now with Afrinic, the agency responsible for assigning IP addresses across African countries, is in crisis because in order to participate in Afrinic, you need to be an internet service provider. You need to have an autonomous system number. You need to be an agent of building networks. And if we don't actually focus and invest in that ability to invest, then we're further becoming, as Gillian says, consumers rather than citizens in this process.
Thanks, Steve. Carlos, 1 minute, please.
No, less than that.
Less than that.
Well, we live in a diverse world with diverse societies, and in many ways the internet has been homogenized in the way that it's being provided. And I think at the center of this solution for equitable digital inclusion, we need to embrace the diversity of solutions because, again, as Leandro was saying, like many people will use the internet differently, and talking to what Steve was saying in relation to autonomy, we need to enable the capacity of diverse ways of engaging, building, using, etc. And neither from the investors, not from the regulators or the ministries, that ecosystem is there to enable and support that diversity, right? The risk is there. People are willing to take the risk. People are willing to do these interventions, but they don't have an enabling ecosystem.
Thanks very much. Sophie, please, you've got like 25 seconds.
All right. Well, Carlos, you gave me a perfect segue because I think all of us agree we need a different mindset, right? So we need a different mindset to close the gap, that difficult gap. But that different mindset needs a different set of tools, skills, and processes. So I think it's not just about policy and regulation, but really that approach and experimenting, right? We need that variety of solutions and being bold enough to be able to experiment. You think of the regulatory sandboxes. So I think agility is key. Boldness is key. Having the necessary regulatory skills is key. And I think I've also heard that cross-sectoral collaboration, right? We need to think, if you think of digital financial inclusion, that's automatically the working between the sectors.
Okay.
So all of that is key.
Thank you so much, Sophie, because that was quite a nice summing up for us that we're not going to have time to do, of highlighting some of those issues. We've got offline, Claire, if you want to just give us a 10-second response, please do.
Sure. I mean, I think what we're all alluding to is there's no one sort of silver bullet, that everything we do needs to be grounded in the realities of the people we're trying to connect and connect in a meaningful way. And so I think we need, and I think also what is critical is not only understanding people's needs and barriers, but also taking a kind of holistic approach. It's not about just giving coverage or giving devices. We need to think about skills, relevant content, that ecosystem that Carlos was talking about, enabling that kind of, so we need to be thinking holistically about the barriers, and it needs to be grounded in really the needs and barriers of the different communities, and it is different. Communities are different, and their needs and barriers are different, and thinking about that in that way.
Okay, I think we don't have a chance, Gillian, unless you have we're off time, but if you want to have a 5-second, 10-second response, please go ahead.
I think you should trust your own instincts, Alison, because I think you know exactly how we should recenter sustainable development into this agenda for what is being called digital inclusion. So thanks again for your leadership.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Gillian, and for all the pioneering work over so many years. My only thing, I can't help myself. Yes, Steve, Starlink does come down and you just switch on the internet, but it also doesn't come free, even though a lot of the discourse is that this is this incredible free service is going to solve all our universality problems. And the other thing I just want to leave us with lots of these really important access solutions, but that are not, that are kind of community or collective access solutions, is that should we face another pandemic, which we inevitably will, but if we should face it this month, this year, we are not going to be any better off than we were, where the last pandemic put the majority of Africans at risk who were unable to digitally substitute, both for the health risk and, of course, the economic risks that were associated with lockdowns. They could not get to community centres, they could not get to libraries, and they could not get to schools. And they saw the greatest negative outcomes, death, from being unable to mitigate that risk digitally. So onwards and forwards with these solutions, and I'm still looking forward for some of those non-access solutions that we can take forward into the final G20 equitable digital inclusion, responding to evidence of demand-side constraints. Thank you so much. Thanks to our fabulous panelists and to the audience.